You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
We'll try to slice it.
Who art it? Mr. Wood art Ed me.
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, where we explore visual arts in an audio medium. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and joining me today, I'm very excited to have Greg Thomas. Thank you very much for taking the time.
No, thanks very much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
No, I was glad that you were willing to come on to my show because I first came across your website, theartteacher.net, a little while ago. It was recommended to me to check out. I saw it on social media, and you have developed such a wonderful wealth of resources of all different types of artists, the kind of thing that I try to do with my show. And I think you're doing it in a beautiful form. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks. That's a really nice compliment. It's a lot of work, and it didn't used to be. It's more work than it used to be now. But my students find it really useful, particularly the pages about specific artists, or if they're looking for artists inspired by food, for example, they can have a flick through. And I've tried to make it as student friendly as possible, so not really as intimidating as finding facts about the art or listing off the same generic responses like this is unique or this is different. So I've tried to use questions in there that I think my students respond to quite well, and they did seem to, which is why I carried on.
Yeah, and I like I say, I think it's a really nice, valuable resource, and I think part of the reason I find it really helpful is because you've developed it in a way that is student friendly. So it's like something I can put out in my classroom, but also just as an art teacher, sort of an authority figure with the mind of a child, I appreciate that you've broken it down to a level that even I can understand. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks for the compliment.
And so today we're going to be talking about an artist that, I'm going to be honest, was kind of new to me. When you suggested her, I had to kind of look her up. I was not familiar with Phyllida Barlow. Did I pronounce that right?
I think it's pronounced Phyllida.
Phyllida. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay.
One day I will pronounce a name correctly, but that day is not today.
It's not a typical or common name over here either. So,
Okay. But I appreciate your being so kind about the corrections, as anytime I'm talking to somebody with a British accent, I just have this inferiority complex because I hear your accent and think you must know more than I do. Do you have that on your end too? Do you hear my American accent and think this guy doesn't know what he's talking about?
No, and I think it's all a ruse that we do know what we're talking about. Just because it means English doesn't mean that we know what we're on about. It's fine.
Well, talking about Phyllida Barlow, Phyllida, right? Phyllida Barlow.
I try to say it with a lid.
Okay. Now, talking about Phyllida Barlow, she was born April 4th, 1944, Newcastle, England. So kind of a rough time when you think about everything that was going on. 1944, just historically, that's a rough time to be growing up. Her father was a psychiatrist, Erasmus Darwin Barlow, which interesting connection. Speaking of history, great grandson of Charles Darwin.
Yeah.
And, she grew up in London, like I said, recovering from World War II. And in 1960, she goes to the Chelsea College of Art, where she studied under George Fullard. Are you familiar with Fullard?
No, not until I did a little bit of research about Phyllida either.
Yeah.
And to be honest, apart from when I was at university, I tend not to look into artists' history that much, really, because I've no need to at the minute. I will with the students a little bit, but it's more at the minute what I've got time for, and what I'm interested in is work and artwork, and then I'll, if I've got a little bit of time, look back on what the artist's history was, what they've done, the past exhibitions, where they grew up, all that sort of thing. But no, primarily, I think I'm just interested in their artwork.
See, and that's funny because I am in some ways almost the opposite, because I find their background informs so much of their art, or at least it helps me to understand their art. Because when I think of when I look at Barlow's work, understanding that she was growing up in a time of London recovering from World War II, a lot of reconstruction I'm imagining happening after, the war was so devastating to everything in that environment. Mm-hmm. And then I also think about she's studying under a sculptor who she said was a big influence on her work, with that idea of art as the experience, and things can sort of fall apart and decay and be built up. And her sculptures are monumental, but they don't feel monumental in the sense of it is going to necessarily stand the test of time.
Yeah, they're not on a pedestal.
You know what I mean? And
yeah, absolutely.
And in that sense, I feel looking at her background really helps me to understand this work. Because when I first looked at her work, just on the surface level, I was a lot less interested in it than I was when I came to understand that background.
Mm-hmm. It definitely informs a reading of her work, doesn't it? Her, saying completely valid as well. So
yeah, and so after that, she's going to art school. She went to the Slade School of Art, 1966. And she had a quite full career teaching. She spent 40 years teaching. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I find, just because I always like to think of the historical context, 1960s, sounds like she was studying under some people who were less than stellar in terms of treating women as equals. I think I read a quote somewhere where she was told by one of her teachers, we're not going to spend much time talking about your work, because by the time you're 30, you're going to be out of the arts. You're going to be, a mom or making jam or something just disgustingly dismissive.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things I always find inspiring about these artists' narratives is she overcomes that stigma, or the dismissive attitudes of people in her time. She carved out a career for herself. She rose up, she graduated from Slade, and by the end of her career, she's teaching there. She's a professor, and I think she was in charge of a department head there. Mm-hmm. And so then, after a full career, like I said, 40 years teaching art in these various school contexts, then she comes back to becoming a full-time artist, which again, I just have to think to start an art career, which is very difficult to do for anybody, to be doing that basically when most people are retiring. She dedicates herself full-time to art around the age of was it 65 maybe?
I'm just looking,
yeah, somewhere around there.
Very late.
Yeah, 2010 I believe is when or 2009 is when she retires, and by 2010 she's getting representation from big art dealers. She had that breakthrough, a breakthrough show within a year of starting to dedicate herself full time. So in the last decade or so, she's had exhibitions around the world, all major institutions, the Tate, the new museum in New York, the Venice Biennial. She's part of the Royal Academy in London. Yeah. She's just, it's funny. She's spent 40 years to become an overnight sensation in the art world.
Yeah. I think having obviously a personal belief, and then the drive behind that belief as well, just to go for it and have such a huge change of direction yourself must be, one, daunting, but two, well, most people would just find it impossible. So she's, I think, personally inspirational in that sense, in that she's just absolutely gone hell for leather and done what she wanted to do, and did it really successfully as well.
Yeah, and as an art teacher, I find some inspiration in this because, one, I always love the narrative of a person who persists and pursues their dream, but also just like I look at it and some of her sculptures look like they were made by an art teacher, just pieced together with what was lying around, scraps of cardboard and fabric and paint. And it feels like it shouldn't work, but it does, It's like, it feels in some ways like, you raided the art closet and came up with something absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. And I think if you're not really a maker of art, or if you're even a young person getting to grips with making art, in school we do projects based on recycling and reusing materials, and it's so difficult to get something that's cohesive and makes sense as a piece of artwork, even though you know what you want. And I as the teacher can visualize what I want. I've got the materials to do it. It's so difficult to do something that even looks good sometimes. And the idea of some of the things that come into work, like using the same technique over and over again, you can do it and you can show the students and you can hope to build a project around it maybe as a teacher, but it's very hard to get something that's really successful out of those sorts of projects without lots and lots of guidance for the students as well.
Yeah, I mean, that getting that unity and getting something that's aesthetically pleasing with that variety of materials becomes a lot more challenging than I think a lot of people realize.
Mm-hmm.
And so now getting into her work and the aesthetics and stuff like that, I wanted to turn our attention to talk about like one specific piece. So I pulled here two photographs of Untitled, the Upturned House 2 from 2012. Yeah. This was a piece that was at the Tate. And I know when you mentioned her, you had talked about having recently seen her work in person. I don't know if this is one you've actually seen up close and in person, but this is one that just caught my eye because, well, there's a lot going on there, but I would love to get your read on this piece. What are you seeing here? What's jumping out to you?
I think it's so hard to show on the picture, but it's so imposing when you see it. It's so huge. The scale and the complexity of something like that, which seems so simple, sticking all these materials together, but I think the more I think about it, the more of a contradiction it becomes. So all of the colours that she's chosen to use, all of the sort of sheets stuck together and plastered together and layered together, and then the angle that it's at, they almost look like they could be very light pieces of cardboard, very delicate, but obviously they're not. So there's the whole idea of like scale and weight and mass made up of these very, perhaps fragile pieces, and the impact of that on, well, when I saw it, definitely in the Tate, it was just, I wouldn't say overwhelming because I didn't find it overwhelming, but it was the impact of it and the scale. It was, sort of incredible.
That's interesting that you started to use words like delicate or light to describe some of the panels put together, because and this is my read off of it, just like it feels very imposing to me looking at it, like the sort of steps coming out of it towards the top that looks to me like concrete, like it looks heavy, and it's at this angle that feels unstable. It feels like it could collapse on you at any point. And it feels patched together. In some ways, this to me feels like something that is the accidental result of like my handiwork around the house, where it's like, okay, I tried this patch and then I tried this patch and then I tried this patch. And it's all these patches that come together in layers that maybe get the job done, but not in a beautiful or elegant or unified way.
Yeah. It seems so haphazard, but obviously and like you said, so precariously balanced that you didn't want to get too close to it. But then obviously there's the fact is that it is strong and steady and sturdy and grounded. So all of these sort of opposites float around, well, my thoughts. And when, if you look underneath it, it seems to be balanced on little small blocks and pieces and chunks. And I think the jump between, right, it's finished, and the making, when do you finish, is, I don't know when that happens, but it does look finished enough to be, visually, aesthetically pleasing. But at the same time, you could say it still doesn't look finished. So it's almost like it's juggling a line. It's between two sort of separate ends of a seesaw. It's really unusual.
Yeah, you're right. When it comes to like the craftsmanship of it, it doesn't feel finished in the sense of being like really polished.
Mm-hmm.
You can see these rough edges on the painted panels and all of that. And yet at the same time, I buy it as a completed work of art. I think because it is balanced and because it is stable, even if it doesn't look stable, it is actually balanced and stable.
Yeah.
And those panels come together in an interesting way. To me, I don't know if it's the color scheme, but it reads as very almost 70s to me.
Yeah. At the inside, some choices of color, maybe from the 70s, or the inside of houses. When you see sometimes they've been knocked down partially, and you'll see some questionable choices that people make for the inside of their houses. No judgment, obviously, but yeah, definitely that strange color palette, and then black and a really heavy red next to those pastel-y colors.
Yeah, it has this feel of almost like you said, when you see a house that's being knocked down, it has this feel of like an excavation of a demolished site. And just seeing the layers of changes and alterations and things patched together. That's my read on it.
Yeah.
Which I find kind of interesting,
Yeah. And there's almost like a repetition to it, as if this isn't what maybe the artist completely had in mind. So maybe they knew part of it was going to look like this, or they were going to use something here or something there. But it's almost like, to me, they were making decisions as they were going along, and repeatedly adding these panels, repeatedly layering them over each other, repeatedly painting one in this color, painting one in that color, and then making decisions about the way it looks towards the end. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about the repetition, and I think that's what gives it the unity to hold, like to make it work as a piece. Because we see, as I'm looking at this, I see those certain pastel colors, that mint green is repeated sort of top, middle, bottom, and is repeated on different sides of the form. I see the same pastel pink repeated in different areas throughout the composition. She's sticking with a certain palette of colors that she's repeating around it, just like those forms that are jutting out from to me, I read it as like, wooden panels stuck together with like concrete forms jutting out from it.
Yeah.
And those are distributed nicely around the composition. Like there's an interesting sort of balance and rhythm to the way those pieces break from that central column.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what holds it all together, is because she is, as much as it feels kind of random, I think it is actually well planned out in terms of like the principles of design and stuff like that, just not in a way that is entirely conventionally aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah, there is a balance, and there's, an evenness to the use of shape and an evenness to the colours, the way they've been spread out. Even the sort of shape, the roundish shape, it's sort of swirls around, and at the same time it's so harsh. I'm just looking at it in a little closer. Yeah, the composition of it is, I think, like you said, to me, very balanced, and obviously it's balancing on the bottom the way it's leaning over as well. So
yeah, so I guess it kind of works in a way that I never would have thought. So I guess to wrap it up, anything else you want to share about this piece, insights, thoughts you had on it, or her more broadly?
Maybe just about her work, listening to interviews and seeing the work up close. There's definitely what seems like from her a thrill in the making and having one concept, whether that's twisting or screwing or scrunching or folding, and using that over and over again, and taking whatever materials she's got and forcing them into something that becomes then a sculpture. And looking at the exhibition in the Tate the other week, that was really clear. It's so hard to pick on photographs, but seeing it in real life, and there was a huge it was like really obvious that, once I've heard this little bit of information about this process, this technique, I see that everywhere now. I can see that in this piece, I can see it here. So taking simple words and applying them really skillfully, I think, is quite important.
Yeah, and I think like you were saying, the enthusiasm with which she does that and just runs into, and I think because and I see evidence of that in the fact that she's doing this when most people, that's her retirement, her leisure is, pursuing this career in the arts and making stuff just for the sake of making it. I think I read somewhere that a lot of her early work no longer exists because she never conceived of the idea that there would be an audience to buy her work. So pieces have been reconstructed, taken apart, become other stuff, or just left there. She's just making stuff for the sake of making it. And I think that's one of those things that I find absolutely beautiful and inspiring. I love to see that in a work when the artist has that joy of creation.
Yeah.
It
was, like you said, a real joy to see the exhibition and a joy to see the work. It was almost gleeful. You could see the enthusiasm just through the artworks. I absolutely loved it. It was one of my favorite shows that I've seen. And yeah, like you said, she would often just leave her sculptures outside and have nowhere to put them. So she just put them in random places outside, and they'd either be found and taken, or someone did get left for years and change and move. So definitely that idea of making for the joy of making.
Yeah, and if I recall my philosophy class from however many years ago, I think, ancient philosophers always said that idea of eudaimonia, and that, finding that thing that you do for the joy of simply doing it. That is kind of the meaning of life, isn't it? To find that thing that you are passionate about for its own sake. So tip of the hat to Phyllida Barlow for finding and capturing that at whatever age. And I'm wrapping it up. I want just a 3-point rating scale. And where should this hang? The Louvre? Is this something to look at? The lab? Is this something to learn from? Or the Louvre? British for the bathroom.
Yeah.
There's a Louvre joke in there somewhere.
Oh, that's terrible.
I'm biased. I'm going to say it's one for the Louvre. I think it says a lot about modern sculpture. I think it has nods to historic sculpture. Yeah, to me, it belongs in the Louvre.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, it feels like a museum piece, if for no other reason, because it in some ways upended my ideas of what sculpture could be. I mean, I went to a conceptual school. I don't feel everything needs to be pretty, but at first glance, I looked at this and I was like, I don't understand how this works, why this works, but it does work. And so it took some thought and some analysis for me to find the rhythm of the pieces as they're assembled. And I always find that interesting. For the sake of being contrarian and argumentative, though, I'm going to say I would throw this one in the loo, just because it feels like in Barlow's style to leave something out to rot and allow it to be ephemeral and everything like that.
Agree to put it in the Louvre.
Yeah.
Maybe one thing that, coming back to what you said at the start about her upbringing and when she was younger, is the title Upturned House 2, and whether that makes a little reference to her past, perhaps, or I know that is obviously what the piece is as well, but whether the idea is more rooted in her own past, or maybe that's a little bit more personal. I just thought of that when we were having a little chat. So. Yeah,
it's always hard to say that, but I do feel like, as you had mentioned before, it has this feel of like an excavation of a house and seeing those questionable color choices and stuff that we had seen from previous generations and stuff like that. That was the connection I took to it. But I think you're right. Maybe it is history and personal experiences and collective experiences from the culture and the time she grew up in. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your taking the time. I'm glad we could figure out the time change and make it work. Thank you very much, Greg Thomas, art teacher from
Manchester. Yeah,
so Greg Thomas, art teacher in Manchester, England. I really appreciate your taking time, sharing your expertise, and I would encourage my listeners to check out your site, theartteacher.net, full of tons of valuable resources and interesting and fun ways of categorizing artists to help people find, the artists who played with food and other stuff like that. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. It was lovely.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted. If you found this tolerable, please like and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week in the show notes, on Twitter @WoodArtEd, and the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.